All right, so covering off today UVs and basic material setup in Blender. UVs are obviously an essential part of the art production pipeline for 3D assets. Essentially what UVs are X and Y coordinate positions that are assigned to each individual face of the entire model. And remember, some of these models have fucking thousands of faces, so this can be quite complicated or quite simple depending on your knowledge of the toolset. But it's essentially location data that tells every face whereabouts on the texture it's going to be projecting. So the fastest way to kind of get orientated and debug your UVs is to come into the shading tab up the top, up here, come down to the middle, create a new shader, and we'll call this debug just for now, just so we know what we're doing. And we'll press Shift A to add, go to the add menu, go into search, and we're just going to type image, and image texture will come up. We'll drop one of those bad boys in, and rather than sourcing something from disk, we're just going to create a new one, and we're going to call it UV grid. And we'll make it the size that we intend the final texture to be. It doesn't really matter, but that's just I guess a habit that I've picked up. And where it says generated type here, we'll just change this to either UV or color grid. Either one's pretty good. Color grid's probably a good one to go for. And we'll just plug that into our base color. And now we'll see that providing that we're actually on look dev or viewport shading up here, we'll now see any shader information that is on our object. Our little cube here in our scene is it's called and heart of the fruit of the oak. So we will see that like this thing actually already has UVs. Basically every primitive object that comes into to Blender will automatically have UVs assigned to it. If we come up to the UV editing tab up here, change to the viewport shading so we can see, we'll see if we select all the faces that they are represented here in the UV space. This square is essentially the one-to-one UV space. This is representative most of the time of the texture that you're going to be using in the shader. It's just a way of thinking about it, I guess. But you'll see if I scale the UVs up and down, they obviously change in scale and change in position on the model there, on the object there. And we'll come to that for a second. So you'll see that the circle, if I select it, it's got some UVs by default. So if I come in here and add our debug texture, it's already got some UVs, not really ideal. You can kind of see that it's a little bit squashed. But that's kind of just the nature of the game when you're dealing with UVs. The thing about them is you're essentially trying to tell Blender how to squash your model out flat without completely destroying the shape so that you can project a flat texture on it, right? So there's multiple ways of doing that. And we'll show you with this shape to start with what I mean. So you can see that I created this shape from a square. So the aspects of the square that were intended, their UVs are perfect, but the areas that I've added, the UVs are all fucked up. And there's multiple ways of unwrapping faces, right? You can do it individually if you want, just by clicking unwrap, unwrap, unwrap them, unwrap, unwrap. It's proportionately going to give you the most accurate representation of the face if you do it this way, but nothing's going to line up properly. Like, you're going to notice the seams on the corners, it's all going to change funny, and it's pretty stupid unwrapping individual faces, obviously. Imagine if you had 10,000 faces. You don't want to be unwrapping 10,000 individual faces. You'd be surprised, some people do it. But there are other tools in the tool belt, obviously, to get us where we need to go quickly. For example, you can select multiple faces and unwrap, okay? And we'll get a different result based on the method that we use to unwrap, but that's worked all right. I could click all these ones and unwrap it, and it's basically just a straight line, see? Because if you were to think about these flattened out straight, right, it's just going to end up being a line. If we were to flatten this and then spread it out, it would end up like that, right? So now when it comes to selecting or unwrapping multiple faces together, there are some kind of fundamental principles that you have to understand before any of this shit starts to make sense. So like if I was to try to unwrap all 4 of these, how would you lay that out flat without it overlapping itself, right? Like, so you're gonna see it ends up distorting because there's no way to lay that out flat without it overlapping. Like if you imagine this as a bit of paper that you tried to flatten out, you'd basically be collapsing this down on itself, right? So you can't do that. It's not going to work. What you can do though is select 3 of them and unwrap those 3, right? Because you could lay those 3 out flat, no problem. So that works. And then you could just join this last guy out by copying the face that it's attached to with this cheeky morsel here, follow active quad. And what that does is it essentially applies the logic to the corresponding face. So you can see it's following on now. Okay, this is really useful for, say, unwrapping something that you wanted to kind of project evenly around a surface. Like for example here, okay, you can see the UVs have worked, but they're disproportionate. I can unwrap one of these guys, and then I can loop select here and use that guy as a reference and use that cheeky follow active quad command. And because they're all in quads, it's just going to wrap all the way around. And I'll show you what that means once you've got once we've got an actual texture on that has practical application, so you can understand that in a minute. So you've got follow active quads, you've got individual face unwraps. Okay, individual face unwrap, like this unwrap thing, it works great in certain circumstances. It takes a little bit of experience to come to terms with like when it works well and when it doesn't, and it really does depend on what you're trying to go for, you know, what sort of result that you're trying to go for. But really all as I end up using the most of the time out of the unwrap tools is unwrap itself, cube projection quite a bit, because I do quite a lot of hard surface modeling, and cube projection is good when you've got quite steep angles between faces. And you have like a lot of 90 degree, 45 degree angles. For example, this one, if I was to put my debug, you'll see that it's all messed up. What I can do is I can actually completely destroy the UVs by scaling them to 0, so we can see what faces have been done properly and what haven't. That's a good tip, by the way. Like when you start a new unwrap, I quite often will scale whatever the UVs they have to 0, just so I can see clearly which faces have been unwrapped properly and which ones haven't. So here's a method to quickly do this guy. Okay, we'd unwrap the top face, we'd loop select all the way around, we'd use this top face as the reference, we'd follow active quads, goes all the way around. Okay, somewhere there will be a seam, and we can find that by just moving this around. Okay, and all you do is like you'd rotate it or you'd move it to the point where you can't really see the seam, where the seam's not visible. Okay, and I think that's there. Boom, sweet, perfect. Then you could just get all these 3 at once, press unwrap, and it should give you a pretty nice square thing. You may need to rotate them from time to time. We can see that these aren't rotated around the same way. Oh, actually they are. That's okay. If you wanted to rotate it, it's the same deal. Like you come over to the UV window, rotate. You can hold Control to snap. Same sort of controls as typical. You can move it. You can move the UVs and constrain them on the X or the Y. There is no Z axis with UVs. UV is basically just 1 and 0 or X and Y. If you look on this square here, this is the representation of the UV space I can't actually remember where 0 and 1 is. It's kind of confusing. I think 1 might be here and 0's here, or 0 and 1, or something like that, on both U and V axis. So it's just location data, right? So if I took this face here and scaled it down and moved it over here, yeah, you see we're getting the blue on this face now. If we wanted that face to be green, we'd move it to there. Now we got the green. Cool. If we wanted that one rotated, we'd rotate it. Yeah, sweet. Conversely, we can follow active quads here by doing a loop select, and that will just push it around the side. Again, here, we could do it here as well. We could just follow those guys. So basically, you select the faces that you want to copy the locations of the nearest quad from, and then select as active the quad that you want to copy from and follow. Okay, so that's pretty easy. Now, like that took several steps. If you just wanted a quick approximation and you weren't being anal about how accurate you were lining up your edges and your seams, again, like cube projection's real good for quick approximations of anything that has kind of steep angles, and you'll get a reasonable result. Sometimes you'll have to maybe move things around a little bit to fix it up, and that's kind of close enough. Another projection method that you have, which I quite commonly use when you've got a kind of interesting shape like this, is you can project from view. It only really works well in orthographic views, but that's just another means of kind of, especially if it's like maybe a shape that does. If it's multiple faces that you're not getting an accurate representation of by just unwrapping, then you can use the project from view, and you can use any of the views. There's certain instances where it's much more useful than kind of what I've built out here to demonstrate. So what we'll do is we'll append in a texture quickly from a project. Oh, no, not that one. Oh, yeah, that one will do. I'll just pull in some materials just so we can see. Okay, so if I was to swap the material over to this brick and marble, okay, we can see where the representation of this particular face is on the UV square. Currently, it's outside the UV bounds. That doesn't matter if you're doing tiling textures, which I believe you probably will be for a lot of the larger assets in the environment. For the smaller props, you'll be doing unique unwraps, which means everything in the entire object needs to ideally fit into this one-to-one space. Which means you've basically got a limited amount of resolution that you're dealing with when you're using a tiling texture workflow. As long as it's tiling and as long as you align the faces correctly, you can basically get an unlimited resolution. You have to come up with solutions for tiling, but it basically means your textures are going to look much crisper on larger models without having to have huge unique textures for every single model that you've got in the game. So it becomes a much more memory efficient way of doing things. And as I say, you can scale it far beyond the limitations of the UV space to get different effects. Obviously, you're going to see tiling if it's massive like that. If you scale it right down, I mean, you could make it so that whole face was just one brick. You'd get some stretching because that's obviously going to be disproportionate, but you could still do it if you wanted to stretch, see how far you could stretch that. And then you could use that follow active quad command to go all the way around, and it will apply the same logic as it goes around. And then we could do the same thing this way. And if we didn't like these guys, we could move them to there, and then we've got big single bricks. yeah, again with that follow active quad, I'm going to just try and drill that into you because it's a pretty powerful time saver. As you can see, we've already done it here, and because we've done it, the bricks line up rather lovely. If we were to just unwrap that, you see what happens because we're trying to collapse the loop. If we take one face out, we're sweet right up until we get to the join, because you could lay that out flat, right? Like if it's, as long as it's not connected, you could lay it out flat, and that's where the seams comes into it. So the seams are basically to break up what's connected, so you can kind of unwrap everything in like one sweep. So if you think about back to how I kind of started, is that you're trying to think about how you can lay all these faces out flat, so you can project a flat texture onto it. The closer you can emulate the ability to lay it out flat for Blender, the less stretching you're going to have in the texture, and the more realistic, accurate, detailed it's going to look. The more you let Blender approximate the unwrap for you, the more you're probably going to see stretching and all sorts of other artifacts, unless you've obviously catered the geometry to be able to do that, which is kind of difficult and kind of limiting, to be honest. So what we could do here is just fill that with the follow active quad, and we'll see that we've got a complete circuit. You could rotate this if you wanted. You could shrink it down, do what the hell you want with it, blah, 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 you get the picture. So with seams, let's just scale these to 0 to reset this. With seams, what you'd do is you'd put a seam everywhere you wanted to imagine separating the bit to lay it out flat, right? So what you do is we go here, you basically just get all the steep edges. The problem with seams is they're obvious because there'll always be kind of a separation in the texture. There's ways of managing it. You can hide it with other objects. Usually it just comes down to where you position them. Okay, so if we put seams here and just press unwrap, it's going to be pretty shit because they're still all closed loops, right? So we need to do one seam down the gut or down the back, down the spine, and now when we unwrap, it's all good. Now if we wanted these bricks to kind of follow around, that's when we'd have to use our follow active quad friend. It works the best when the faces are proportionate. So what you want to do, if you have a disproportionate face like this, when I mean proportionate, I mean kind of equally proportionate in terms of X and Y, right? So, or equally spaced. So what we can do is we can just snap these verts to each other to make it proportionate, and then we can loop select, make sure the one that we've set up to be the reference is the active selected by shift clicking it, and then follow active quads, and now they're looping all the way around, and now we can just scale it down to wherever we need it. And you will see some warping just because of the way that because of the geometry of the object. If I had way more loop cuts, you could get a closer approximation, but we're making game assets, so we kind of have to compromise somewhere. But you can see that that's following around now. Yeah. So you unwrap for kind of your individual faces or your groups of faces, providing you've put some seams in there to make sure that they're not going to loop around on themselves when you try to flatten them out. Your doodaddy, this guy, old cube projection, when you've got kind of, I guess, a cube-like object with a lot of steep angles between faces works as a good approximation, but usually has to clean it up. So again, scale these to 0, scale 0, swap the texture over, and we can just select it all and go cube projection, and it's okay, you know, like if you just wanted a quick fucking doodaddy, sweet, done. Something to take into account is that when you bevel, you're going to get basically Blender's approximation of what it thinks is the best representation of the UVs on the bevel based on the surrounding UVs. So it's almost like a content aware thing. Sometimes, and I find quite often, I end up baking the bevel and then going in and kind of remapping the bevel UVs. Sometimes you want like a crack or something going along these. So it's just something to be aware of, is that the bevel UVs will be approximated by Blender, and it doesn't always do a very good job. So you do quite often have to change that. In terms of like when do you start unwrapping, straight away, really. When your object is in the most primitive form, you want to unwrap it. Like, you don't want to do, and I'm guilty of this quite often, because you get into a flow state and you don't want to stop the task that you're doing. So sometimes when I'm modeling, I'll over model. Basically, I'll model too much, I'll have too much detail already, and I won't have unwrapped the core shapes. And it really does help to do that, because then when you draw a new geometry from it, it's already got the existing UVs that it had from the geometry that it was built from. So it's just a means of, ends up saving you a lot of double handling. You do end up having to, as I say, reset some UVs to 0 for visibility, so you can distinguish between what's been done and what hasn't. But yeah, sometimes, you know, like, you know, if I was just pulling, say, half of this shape, and I wanted to retain the UVs, and I'm duplicating it, it's because I've preset the UVs. It's kind of already done, and then I could add a face to the bottom, and then I could just adjust these UVs and shrink them down or scale them up, you know, like, and all of a sudden it's like it's a different dude. It's a different part of the object. It might have been for a trim, you know, maybe I wanted to, for example, let's say I wanted to add like some real simple detail to this guy by stealing this geo. Okay, it's got the UVs, right? So I'm saving myself time with the process because I've already done it, you know, like, and then the future UVs or the future detail that I add, it's already got a kind of a base for you to start from, you know. So yeah, you pretty much, once you get to the end of your first pass in modeling, because you should always really do it in 3 passes. You do your primitive block in, where it's just a proportional representation of the basic primitives of the shape, just to capture the silhouette. Really, you'd unwrap then at the latest, you know, like you'd unwrap then, and then you'd start adding your detail and because a lot of the times when you're adding detail to an object, you're just pulling geometry from the existing shape and adding to it. So if it doesn't already have UVs, that's just another thing that you're going to have to unwrap later. So yeah, it makes sense to kind of unwrap as you go rather than leaving it right until the end of the model. What else do I need to cover? I haven't really prepared for this, guys, in all honesty. I've been a bit fucking run off my feet this week, so I'm just kind of off the cuffing it. I'm just thinking what else is relevant to know. In terms of organic objects, your best tool is pretty much always to use seams, because you don't want to be going through and unwrapping all the faces, and if you select them all and unwrap it, it's usually a horrific approximation. You could put a seam through the middle and unwrap it and get a reasonably it doesn't really, it's probably not a good example of a texture. If I change this to, say, gold, you'd get a pretty good unwrap doing that, but there's always going to be a seam in the middle, right, where it joins. So then you have to kind of manage that seam. You probably can't see it on the screen. I can see it because I'm a psychopath. But yeah, it really depends on the solution. Like other things that you can do, I guess, with your UVs is I could unwrap this square. I could make this guy, this individual square, represent one of these dudes. Try to be as accurate as possible. You kind of doing the adjustment on this screen, but you're also eyeballing it on this screen because you're not always going to get a perfect representation on this left screen. So you're looking here, you're eyeballing it, you're trying to line it up perfectly, and then you want to make sure that they're perfectly lined up on the same axis, and then you want to follow these quads. And then we should get our little square pattern rotating all the way around. But you can see, because it's not perfectly square, as you get further away, when you're using the follow active quads, as you get further away from the referenced quad, the disproportionateness of the shape increases over distance. It's obviously the math behind what's happening. So I just need to fix this up. So where's my snapping? Yeah. Bear with me, team. Bear with me. That should be better. Yeah. See, that's way better. Now we can see where the seam is, and you could adjust that by just moving him and lining it up wherever you need it. I'm going to get a double up, unfortunately, but you could adjust that. I don't really need to. Sometimes you want to add more geometry so you can be kind of creative with your textures. So if I wanted to add a loop cut in here, so I could do something cool here, maybe just do a big chunk. I mean, it's going to look fucking ridiculous, but just for the sake of demonstration. Let's do a big chunky chunk. Some chunky boy. There we go. And we'll follow him around. And then maybe we wanted to do the same down the bottom. You get the picture. What you'd only really ever have to do, you'd only ever really want to do one half of the object. We could do a seam here and then link select with L and just unwrap and have a different variation up the top. Then what you could do is you could just symmetrize on the Z and copy what you had up the top down to the bottom. Yeah, I mean, I think that should get you started. Does anyone have any questions regarding the process or what you can do and what you can't do, what you can get away with, what you can't get away with? You might, anyone want to unmute their mic if they have a question?
Otherwise, set it to 0.
Yeah, so scaling UVs to 0, basically come over into, or you select all the faces on the object in the edit window of the viewport, then come over to the UV window and just go scale 0 and enter 0 on the number pad.
Oh, sweet.
And that'll that should scale everything right down. Sometimes you need to scale 0. There we go. Any others? Any other questions regarding UVs in general? No? Sweet. All right. Well, I'm sure as you get out there and embark upon this, you'll run into things that confuse you. So maybe compile a list of questions if you do, or when you do, and throw them at me at any point, and I will send you a solution.
What's a good place to get textures from?
Megascans is probably the best place to go. Or if you get a subscription to Substance, Substance has got a good texture library. There's heaps of free resources online, man. You just need to Google. I usually just use Megascans in Photoshop and adjust them, so like kind of paint over pre-existing stuff. But yeah, I'd say use Megascans as a placeholder until someone learns to use Substance Designer. That's probably the best path to go down for creating bespoke materials, or bespoke textures rather. Anything else, lads? Any other queries regarding UVs? I guess another thing I should probably cover off is materials, because most of the materials that you guys are going to be using will obviously be created in Unreal, but you do need a representation of whatever final material you get in Unreal for use as at least previs in Blender, so you can at least line up like what we have done here. Like, like if you had a different texture on here, say a gold texture or whatever, and you had unwrapped it specifically with the albedo information on the texture, when you throw your material on it, like if it's something that has obvious visual markings on it, it's not going to line up. Like, you'll see lack of alignment like this. So it's quite important to make sure that you do have the textures that you are using in Unreal in a project somewhere that you can reference in Blender. Every time you add a new material to something, let's say I wanted to have more than just brick. Let's say I wanted to have some gold around some of the trims, right? You can add a material. I've already prepared a gold. To create materials, you basically just come up to shading here and plug image textures into the shader. We'll do a separate video on that because that's a whole nother beast. Ideally, artists at junior levels should be working with kind of a pre-built library rather than building all the materials themselves, because it's not, you can build simple materials easy enough, but it gets very, very tricky very, very quickly. And you don't want to be investing too much time into something maybe that you don't plan to have expertise in or whatever. If you're interested in it, go hard and definitely throw questions in my direction, because I can help. But video for another time for sure. But let's just say we wanted to add a slot for another shader essentially into your object. You apply the necessary geometry where you want to do it. Let's say we wanted it around the top there, and maybe around there, and maybe around there, and maybe around there. I'm just loop cutting with Control R, and then we'll select all those loops. We've already added our gold shader up here by pressing plus and then picking the one that I'd pre-made, and now we just assign it. And what that does now is it tells Unreal not only is there 2 shader slots, but it tells Unreal what faces each shader is going to be applied to. Okay, and then it won't be named correctly in Unreal when you export and import this. Like, it won't call it the brick marble slot or the gold slot. It'll basically be just slot 1 and slot 2. So when you pull your object into Unreal, you just put your brick marble texture that you got set up that was designed to be the same as how it was in Blender. You'd put it in the top slot, you put the gold in the second. So the slots basically is all that really carries over. And that's how you do that. Any other questions, team, as to what it is, anything really? No? Sweet. I guess that's good. Again, like take the liberty to even just flick me a message and as soon as you encounter the problem, and I'll get to it later. Just be like, hey, bro, how do I do this? You know, and then I can build an FAQ of questions based on that, because I'm sure everybody will encounter the same problems. Sweet.
Solid, John. Thank you very much.
Cool.
Massive, bro. That was a huge situation when it came to the UVs, and I think it's like you were saying, bro, being able to split it up and then have those elements or those slots that you can just drag the materials in. I mean, with the master materials that we're building in Unreal, there's like a certain amount that you can do when it comes to like changing the material scale and things like that. But essentially, like you say, bro, you want to get it done in here so that when you're building pieces from a modular build set, you're building them, like you say, with the carryover of all of the follow quads just happening straight off the bat. So, not mean, bro. Thank you very much for that.
Perfect. Awesome. No worries. All right, team. Well, I've got another an 8:30 appointment, so I'll leave you to it. And again, compile that list. I'm here to help, and I'm only going to be free for another month or two before I go into fucking full power mode. So use me while you got me.